Hi, my name is Jake Morrill. I'm the lead minister at the Oak Ridge Unitarian Universalist Church, and this is going to be a short, I hope, short history of Unitarian Universalism for newcomers to our faith. Now, there might be the idea that Unitarian Universalism was thought up over some lava lamp in 1967, so this is hopefully going to bring you back to the whole long sweep of it. We're going to talk about four eras, sort of early Christian and before, the Protestant Reformation, early Americas, and then current day. Those four sections. And mostly I want to start by telling you that Unitarian Universalism is the conflation or the bringing together of two big theological ideas. Unitarian means one God, one love, as opposed to Trinitarian, three gods or God in three. Unitarian, one love. Universalist, for all. This is a love that leaves nobody out, a love that's not separating people into sheep and goats, damning some, saving the others, but in the end, this is a love that's so great that nobody can escape its reach, its power. Nobody can ultimately sever themselves from the reach and the power, the transforming inclusion of this love. So Unitarian, one love, Universalist, for all. That's the major idea. Now, we start this theological process back even before the start of the Christian church in the early reaches when the tribal religions of the ancient Near East were beginning to evolve and to solidify, and there's two ideas that come up from the people of Israel, from the early Jews. One is monotheism, which is the idea that instead of local gods or deities who are fighting and are connected to aspects of nature, there is one prevailing overall God. And the second idea is related to that. It's about the covenantal relationship with that one God. Now, there were Suzerain Treaties. This was a political arrangement between the vanquished and the conquerors in the ancient Near East. And the idea was it wasn't an equal relationship, but it was a reciprocal relationship. The conquerors said, we will keep your village safe, and in return, you'll give us, 70% of your grain for the harvest season. So it's kind of a quid pro quo, a two-way street, a reciprocal relationship. The early Jews, with their monotheism, their idea of one God, borrowed this political idea of the Suzerain Treaty and put it into theological terms to describe and understand the nature of their relationship with God. So it was a covenantal relationship, a two-way street. Again, not an equal relationship, but a reciprocal relationship. There was something expected on both sides. So it wasn't only a matter of the people making sacrifices to appease some erratic God, but there was more of an understanding of love and grace and forgiveness and second chances with this God. And we see the Hebrew Scriptures, or the Old Testament, is a story again and again of God coming and giving second chances, trying again, dusting themselves off and coming back together with the people. So these are two ideas from the early Jews: monotheism, covenantal relationship. Early Christian era, first century of the Common Era, and this is a time when the Roman Empire has swept across not only all of Europe, but northern Africa as well, including the place where modern-day Israel, which is where Jesus is born. Now, this first century is a time of ferment and upheaval and a lot of revolutionary and radical ideas for how to live under the yoke of empire. There were some that said we need to go along to get along. We need to just integrate ourselves into the ways of empire. There were some who said we need to get out of here. These were the Essenes who were going out to the desert. We need to split this town and purify ourselves out in the desert, totally removed from society. Jesus was of a third way tradition that did not say we need to go along to get along, but neither did he say we need to split the scene and start over out in the desert. He had this sort of different third way, nonviolent way of engaging empire. And whoever he was, however he was, he had this transforming effect. His message, his spirit seemed to be contagious. People all over really took to it. After he died in 33, then a couple of decades later, 45 to 55, is the time when Paul is really spreading the memory of Jesus in his own interpretation. So house churches all over, small communities telling the story, remembering the teachings of this Jesus really come along. But it's not until 70 AD, with the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem, that Christianity really gets rooted and becomes a viable new branch of the Jewish tradition. Now, there's a theological problem with the destruction of the Second Temple, and that is that until that time, the Judeans, the Jews, the people that Jesus had come from, believed that if you want to find God, here's the house, here's the temple, here's the place where you find God. So the destruction of the temple is not only a local problem, it's a theological problem. How do you find God? Rabbinic Judaism, the modern day Judaism, answers this crisis by forming a new iteration of Judaism based in stories and rituals that allows it to be a portable faith fit for a people of the diaspora. The Christian tradition, another fork of Judaism, is trying to remember Jesus in this with the same light. A story that's a tradition of stories and rituals and a faith that's more portable than trying to defend one single physical address. Now, the question is, for early Christians, who was that masked man? Different people had different ideas, and the conversation goes for the 3 centuries long in the early church. Who was this masked man? Different people had different ideas. Some said that Jesus must have been supernatural, must have been a face of God or a manifestation of the divine himself. And that is called a high Christology. If you, the more you think that Jesus is godlike or is supernatural, you've got a high Christology. There were some who had a low Christology. A low Christology means that you think Jesus is more human than divine, more human and of the natural world than of the supernatural world. Unitarians were people in this conversation in the first few centuries with a lower Christology who said that Jesus was more human than divine. And so this is where you get Unitarian, the idea that Jesus is not being worked into some configuration of the Trinity or understanding of the divinity with 3 faces of God, but that Jesus is a human or somebody who is filled with the Spirit of love, but is pointing people toward the one God. So Unitarian, that's the implication of low Christology. There's also another implication, which is if you understand Jesus as mostly divine, mostly supernatural, the faith response is one of devotion, of praying to that figure. If you understand Jesus as human, as not so unlike you and me, then the faith response is ethical, trying to live a life that is similarly compassionate, radically generous, radically loving, as Jesus's was. So here we see some of the implication of these beliefs of how you live your life. It's why Baptists and other sort of evangelicals who are centered on the supernatural person of Jesus orient themselves devotionally and prayerfully. And then it's why Unitarians and others who with a lower Christology are organized and oriented ethically toward behavior, moral behavior that would walk in the footsteps of Jesus. Now we're going to get to, we're no longer only a Christian faith, so this is only our roots that we're talking about. If you're coming in and you're a humanist or a pagan or something else, so hang on there. Now that's only the Unitarian side of the question. The Universalist side of the question, if the Unitarians were saying, what is the nature of Jesus? Universalists were saying, what is the nature of God? So the Universalists were the ones who were saying the nature of God is infinite love. If God is infinitely powerful, and if God's nature is loving, then infinite power plus infinite love means that no matter our mortal efforts, no matter our mortal transgressions, in the end, love's going to get you. Love's going to sweep you up and be part of that healing. Now, different people had different ideas of when and how that happened, but Universalists say that in the end, all will be saved. Origen, who was an early Universalist theologian, said in the end, even Satan will be won over, converted, and transformed by this great power of God God's love. So that's the radical universalists. Now, both Unitarians and Universalists exist throughout the Christian tradition as mostly heresies. 325 AD is the Council of Nicaea, where Trinitarianism, God as part of three, becomes the official stance of the Christian church. And so Unitarians and Universalists live on the margins of the Christian tradition for the next 1,200 years or more. So we're going to move now to the Protestant Reformation. The Protestant Reformation was set up in the 1400s with the development of the printing press, which increased literacy throughout Europe, and now people had direct access to the scriptures themselves and could study and learn and argue and disagree and engage with the tradition directly instead of mediated through the Catholic Church. And secondly, in 1492, the arrival of the Europeans with Columbus to the Americas sort of shattered the worldview. So you've got these revolutionary things happening. And so in the early 1500s, 1517, you've got Luther putting the theses on the door of the Wittenberg Chapel, all meant as a reform effort. But what started as a reform effort begins to spread into a real religious revolution. And so you've got basically the Protestant Reformation in all of its various textures and colors and kinds, saying that no longer does your relationship with God need to be mediated through the traditions, the rites, and the officials of the Catholic Church. They say sola scriptura, only Scripture, Scripture alone. So each individual can have this experience of God, this relationship with God, mediated by the text of Scripture, mediated by stories. Now, there are some who begin to formulate some doctrine, some orthodoxies around that. Well, you can't interpret it that far or that individually, but there are those in the 1520s called the Radical Reformation, and these are ancestors of the Mennonites, the Baptists, the Quakers, and the Congregationalists, which is the Unitarians, who say, no, really, the individuals can interpret and receive the Holy Word themselves on their own. They have these individual experiences. So if you've got the Radical Reformation folks saying that God is something that moves from freedom through freedom toward freedom for each person, how do you hold a congregation together? How do you not have people just sort of wandering off, thinking their own thoughts and that sort of thing? And that's where the Radical Reformation reclaims the idea of covenant. Now remember covenant from the early Jews? This is the idea of reciprocal relationship with God. Now, the Protestant Reformation translates that instead of a vertical relationship with God, they've got it as a horizontal relationship that is the glue of this community of free people, of free thinkers, all of whom are having their own experiences of the divine, their own interpretations of Scripture, but nevertheless drawn together, held together by covenant. So this is one of the big ideas in the Radical Reformation. Free people thinking on their own, individual relationship with the holy, with the divine, with life itself, drawn together, held together by covenant, by respectful mutual love for one another, held in that common care. Now, in the decades to follow, the conversation and the upheaval in Europe continues. There is Michael Servetus, a Spaniard, who in Paris gets hold of a Bible and begins to look through it, and he writes a book called On the Errors of the Trinity. He doesn't find any necessity for the Trinity there. In fact, he believes that a Unitarian view would be more inclusive. He's writing in the time of the Spanish Inquisition, and so he's, as a corrective, he says, well, if we as Christians can understand God's unified nature, that there's one God, then we can be in better relationship with Jews and Muslims. That does not go over well. He's burned at the stake in 1553 by John Calvin, one of the religious leaders. And Michael Servetus' death sets off a conversation about religious tolerance throughout Europe. So this is a real, people are saying, well, wait a minute here. Is this the freedom that we had imagined? In 1568, about 15 years after Michael Servetus is put to death, John Sigismund becomes the young king of Transylvania. It's the only time Unitarians have ever been on the throne. And one of his first acts is to set forth the Edict of Torda, which is the first declaration of religious freedom and freedom of conscience in Europe. He says that, nobody can be coerced into worshiping in a manner that's at odds with what their heart tells them to be true. true. And so he provides, from his political power, provides for religious freedom to a limited extent in Transylvania. So you hear that this theological stance of individual freedom has political implications with right of conscience, freedom of conscience, and the separation of church and state. Even way back there, we're hearing those